Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Ontario budget is out. We'll talk to Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy about some of the highlights, the letdowns, and things that piqued our interest.
Then we're going to zoom out and take a bit of a broader look at the budget, what's in there, what's missing, and what the next year might look like.
We might be taking a bit of a slight break from our three-issue format today, but we hope to offer analysis about how the budget might shape the lives of the people of Ontario.
And in your column, my column, I'm going to focus on the province's promise to give eligible homeowners an HST break.
And I am shining a spotlight on a subject that I've asked the Treasurer about, maybe 200 times over the last 6 straight years. Nothing has changed yet, so I'm still going to pester him about it. Stick around and find out what it is.
It's Friday, March 27th, 2026, so let's get to it.
JMM?
Steve.
A little post-budget day sugar to start with there.
Yes,
Can we call it that?
Day after budget.
Now, I am wondering whether or not the choice of your shirt today is significant, and are you trying to say something about the budget or the budgetary process or something by having a bunch of dinosaurs on your shirt?
Well, okay, so I'm wearing a Jurassic Park t-shirt. This budget, I'm assuming, was not 65 million years in the making, as the original tagline for the movie was. But Jurassic Park, of course, spawned a sequel and now a whole franchise of films. And it turns out the 2025 budget, which was called A Plan to Protect Ontario, has also spawned a sequel because the 2026 budget is also called A Plan to Protect Ontario.
Well, what do you know?
And this is the first time I've seen this in my 12 years of covering Ontario budgets. They always give the budget a title, but they tend to mix it up, and the point is to give the government's policies for the coming year a bit of a theme, right? You're going to tie together a bunch of announcements, and traditionally they change up the theme.
Yes.
But I guess this year they have decided they're just going to play the hits again.
Well, maybe unlike every other sequel, which is never as good as the original, they think that this year's sequel is like Godfather 2, which everybody thinks was better than Godfather 1. Not me, but everybody else does.
I think if you're going to try that gamble, you really got to be sure you got Godfather 2 on your hands.
Well, we will discuss over the next however much time we have, on a half an hour or so, about whether or not this is a Godfather sequel, which means better than last year, or whether this is a typical sequel, which means not quite as good as the original.
Iron Man 2, perhaps.
Very good. Well, consistent, I would say, with the theme of having a finance minister on the show this week. We've got Peter Bethlenfalvy coming up. I thought I would wear a former finance minister's T-shirt this week as well, because that just sort of seems symmetrical, right? And I've got, shall I stand up here? There we go. It says, "We Believe in Eves." These are the T-shirts that they gave out at the 2002 Ontario Progressive Conservative Leadership Convention, which was 24 years ago this week. Ernie Eves was the finance minister at the time. He was running to replace Mike Harris, who was the premier at the time, and had stepped down the previous, I guess it was Thanksgiving. He stepped down. Ernie Eves brought in a lot of budgets. He brought in 6 budgets for the Common Sense Revolution Conservatives. The first one was the most dramatic. He cut provincial income taxes by 30%. He also cut welfare rates by 22%. But he would hasten to add that still left them 10% above the national average. 24 years ago this week, he replaced, who did he beat? He beat Jim Flaherty.
Yes.
On the second ballot, so it was not exactly a barn burner of a convention. Everybody pretty much, Ernie Eves was the front runner going in. He won the leadership on the second ballot. It was not one of the more dramatic leadership conventions. And he then became Ontario's 23rd premier, and this was the T-shirt they gave out at the convention. And I don't know if we can get a shot from behind her. Sheldon, do I have to turn around? Because there's a little something I got to turn around. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Can you see that?
Yes, so we've got Ernie going down the back of the shirt.
Lots of Ernie's as people chanted his name at the convention. And Mr. Eves will tell you he picked exactly the wrong time to become the 23rd premier of Ontario, because we had the massive hydro blackout on the northeastern seaboard. We had a case of mad cow disease. We had SARS, in which 44 people in Toronto lost their lives.
Yes.
So it was a really difficult time to take over, not to mention that he was coming in after 8 years of very dramatic common sense revolution under Mike Harris. So tough time.
I actually am remembering that was actually, I think, the first political convention I ever went to.
Is that right? Isn't that adorable?
I went there. My father was covering it, and I I guess I would have been 21 that year. And I had spent much of my young life insisting I was not going to go into journalism or anything, but my dad was covering this thing. He said, hey, it might be interesting. Do you want to come along? And I was sure. So I hung around with other CBC reporters that day. A few memories of that event. One was getting literally bowled over by a moving scrum at one point. Somebody was crossing the floor or whatever. The other was just when I arrived that day, coming down the stairs at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre South Building, rival camps, one side chanting Ernie, Ernie, the other side chanting Jim, Jim, Jim. And as I'm coming down the escalator, there's this pause and everybody starts chanting Mike, Mike, Mike. They wanted Mike Harris to stick around. They did not get their wish, but that was just one of those moments that stuck in my brain.
Yeah, they're great memories of these leadership conventions when they are delegated conventions. I had to get that in. Had to. And with that, I think the treasurer is on standby, so let's get to him. Yes. Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy coming right up. The Ontario government brought down its budget yesterday. They are still calling it, as JMM just indicated, a plan to protect Ontario, although they also tell us that Ontario did pretty well protecting itself from President Trump's tariffs and other trade irritants. Let's go through some of the highlights here. JMM, where do we want to begin?
Well, we're going to dig into some of the other details later, but I think the top line number to know about for the interview with the finance minister coming up is that the province has a $13.8 billion deficit. That is not just higher than what the government was projecting in last year's budget for this year. It is also higher than last year's budget deficit. The government is also pushing back by 1 year their target for when they will balance the budget. They were hoping to have a razor thin surplus next year. That will now be 2 years out from now. As you can see on the chart, if you're watching at home, basically, I think it's fair to say that the projections for this year and for the next 2 years have gotten worse relative to just what was projected last year. A bunch of questions about that in terms of, how the government has responded to Trump's tariffs since the election, which was, of course, justified on the threat of those tariffs and how we would respond to them. A few other notable things was announced the day before the budget was presented, the HST exemption for new homes sold in Ontario. The previous HST rebate announced by the province and the federal government had been targeted at first-time homebuyers. This will now be more generally available. It's going to cost the province about $1.4 billion and will be eligible for homes. The full rebate will be eligible for homes up to $1.5 million.
Can I say a fast word about that?
Yes, please.
It's so funny nowadays. Back when I was your age, back when I was actually half your age, when I first started getting into lockups, I guess this was probably my 39th or 40th lockup or something like that. Everybody had to be very, very concerned about not leaking anything out of the budget because they didn't want it to affect the stock market, which is why they don't let you report on it until after 4 o'clock when the markets close. Governments are leaking their own budgets all the time now.
Yes.
This is the biggest, ticket item in this budget, the HST exemption on the new home sales, and they announced it the day before the budget.
Yes.
So throw the rules out there. There are no more rules anymore.
Yeah, there's a whole debate to be had about how these budgets are communicated and whether some of the old rules make any sense anymore. The other item, and we're going to talk about this a bit more, but there's a $4 billion Protect Ontario Account Investment Fund. This idea is actually the government is going to take $4 billion that they actually had announced as $5 billion last year. They only ever spent $1 billion of it. So now they're going to take the remaining $4 billion and move it forward into a fund that is going to, they hope, bring in lots of private investment as well to match that. And they are going to go looking for more future-oriented industries that they can grow here in Ontario. And I'm sure the finance minister will have some things to say about that. All right, Steve, what was on your radar?
Well, it's less about what was on my radar and more about who was on my radar. And the who is Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy, who joins us now from the Frost Building at Queen's Park. And Treasurer, it's good to have you back on TVO. How are we feeling on Budget Day +1?
Feeling great, and it's good to be with you and John Michael and yourself again.
Thank you. JMM, over to you.
Minister, I think one of the biggest items from this budget is that a balanced budget projection has been kicked back another year. This government has been promising to balance the budget since it was first elected. Why hasn't the government been able to meet that goal so far?
Events, dear John Michael, events. We've come out of a pandemic, big inflation, the tariff situation and now conflict in the Middle East. So, this is the world that we're in right now. We have to adapt to that world. We're committed to balancing. That's been our goal all along, and we'll continue to do that. I would say that I think we're the only province that is balancing in 2 years. So, and we're committed to doing that. But then again, governments around the world, their deficits are increasing. Ours also is increasing because our population grew by 2 million people over the last 8 years, 2/3 of that since the beginning of COVID. So that's put a lot of pressure on the expenditure side, and I'm not going to cut spending in healthcare, education, or social services. That's 2/3 of our budget right there. We're going to continue to make that investment.
Your government, of course, prides itself on never having raised a tax since you took over at Queen's Park in 2018. But I am curious, and so I want to ask you this question. Are there any circumstances under which you think it's appropriate or useful to raise taxes?
Can't think of one. And, we followed up yesterday with tax cuts for small businesses, for example, Steve. 375,000 businesses will benefit from a 30% tax cut for small businesses. I think this will help economic growth, economic prosperity, bring good jobs, and they're the economic engine. So we're more leaning the other way, making life more affordable, not just for businesses, but for families and individuals. And by the way, a lot of small businesses are owned by small families and individuals who are trying to make a living.
One of the other big announcements in this budget was a $4 billion Protect Ontario Account Investment Fund. We've seen agencies kind of like this elsewhere, and I'm thinking in particular of the Federal Infrastructure Bank, but it had kind of disappointing results. Why do you think this is going to work in Ontario where it hasn't worked as well in other jurisdictions?
Well, I wish you had compared it to the Building Ontario Fund, which is our infrastructure bank that we just launched, I think, a year and a half ago. It's set up in the same way, and its goal is to build more infrastructure that wouldn't otherwise get built and build it faster on an arm's length basis with governance and a chair and a board in place to manage not only the taxpayers' money, but also bring in other investors to get those deals done. Since the inception, they've invested in like the Rakai Center in the Distillery District. Peter Rakai told me that long-term care facility he's been trying to build for 13 years. Our Building Ontario Fund helped them get that past the finish line. Toronto Metropolitan University, we helped them do through that agency, Building Ontario Fund, 1,400 student housing spaces, more than doubling what they have. And of course, our investment in small modular reactors. That was all done through the Building Ontario Fund. We set that up for infrastructure. We're now setting up the Protect Ontario Investment Fund. I wanted to signal our intent. There's a lot of details that we will be working out and finalizing over the months to come. But the idea, bottom line, is that we can continue to invest, bring other investors, our pension funds, asset managers, life companies, investments, so that we can multiply the effect of the taxpayers' money so that we can grow companies here in Ontario. We see too often companies that once they commercialize and get an AI or technology platform, they look elsewhere for the investments and the intellectual property, and the patents leave this country, the talent leaves this country. I want to have more investment, be it in technology, critical minerals, energy, advanced manufacturing, life sciences, defense, here in Ontario, and to help companies grow, and that's what that fund is going to do.
Treasurer, my next question, I know you would be incredibly disappointed with me if I didn't ask, because I've only asked it of you about 247 times over the last 6 years. So what the heck? For old time's sake, let's go around this merry-go-round one more time. Your government is subsidizing electricity bills for the people of Ontario to the tune of almost $7 billion a year. That represents more than half the deficit at the moment. It is not means-tested, meaning that you and I both get our hydro bills subsidized by the taxpayers. You send me $46 a month that I don't need or want, and I'd frankly rather you spent it on something that, would make more sense, like maybe other people's electricity bills who are lower income. Why are we still doing things this way when almost every other observer points out this is the wrong way to do things?
Well, thank you for bringing it up the sixth time in a row. You look, I'm going to give you the sixth answer in a row. The $2 billion that we use the Ontario electricity rebate is to help individuals, help small businesses, help farms. So it's an affordability measure. There's another $3 billion that goes to companies and industrial and commercial buildings that's helping them with the electricity prices. It's a legacy of previous governments that the bills are a lot higher. There's a lot of legacy costs to the wind and solar and the overpayment for those infrastructure. So that has to be borne by the taxpayers, and that's what this is, providing some relief against those cost increases. The additional funds are going to support Indigenous and low-income electricity relief programs as well. It all adds up to $6.9 billion in the budget. And like everything, and I said this yesterday, we're going to look at everything in this program to see, are we doing things as efficiently as we can? And we're going to do that in other areas, like in our healthcare system. Look at OHIP and our Ontario drug program. Are we spending the money efficiently? Is it getting to the right people? Is there any abuse? Because what I want to do is make sure that the money that we are giving, the $100 billion in healthcare, $40 billion in education, $20 billion in social services, getting through to the frontline workers, the social service worker, the teacher, the nurse, for the benefit of our most vulnerable, our students and our patients, because that's we want to make sure every last penny gets to the right place.
Well, I didn't want to disappoint you by not asking the question again for the 6th year in a row. And as we thank you for your time and we say goodbye to you, I just want to let you know I'm wearing Ernie Eaves's T-shirt right now because 24 years ago this week, he, the former finance minister, ran to replace the then premier of the day to become the premier of Ontario. And I just can't help but wonder whether the current finance minister has any, I don't know, secret plans when Doug Ford's had enough to replace him. The question just pops into my head. You want to put us out of our misery and give us an answer on that?
No, first of all, the premier has indicated he's running for a long time, and I fully support that. He's a great leader. I'm privileged to work with such a visionary leader. But let me tell you this. He once did say to a public audience with Ernie in the audience, he said that Peter Bethlenfalvy, he's the best finance minister ever in the province of Ontario. And Ernie piped up and said, hey, Premier, what about me? So, yeah, Ernie got his shot in, but the Premier stuck to his guns. And I have a lot of respect for Ernie. He did a great job in the province, and I wish I could see that T-shirt. And thank you for asking me about the Ontario electricity rebate, Steve. As I said yesterday, I did not see that question coming. So thank you for asking that again.
Same time next year, Treasurer. Thanks for your time and take good care.
My pleasure. Look forward to it. Bye for now.
Okay, that's our conversation with the finance minister. And you know what? Let me pick up on one thing as we continue our coverage of the 2026 budget here.
Yeah.
And that is the issue of tax increases.
Yes.
And given that I'm wearing Ernie Eaves's T-shirt today, I think this is particularly germane because I think Mr. Eaves came into power also believing that governments had enough money to do what they wanted. It was a question of how they were spending it and could they, keep a sharp hand on the financial tiller. I was interested to hear Mr. Bethlenfalvy say there are no circumstances at all that he can conceive of raising taxes. As I say, Mr. Eaves thought the same thing until after 9/11, when we used to have legislation in this province saying if you want to increase taxes, you got to have a referendum, go to the people,
Yes.
and they need to give you permission.
Yeah, still technically on the books, I believe.
Well, guess what? After 9/11, and Mr. Eaves, I guess, changed his mind at that point because he needed more revenue, and they decided, without having a referendum, I think they passed a little law saying, yes, the referendum legislation still exists, but we're taking a little exception in this case right here. And they did bring in tax increases after Mr. Eaves was premier. And there apparently are and were circumstances when tax increases were necessary, but I guess not under this guy.
Well, and, so we've already discussed that. I think it's fair to say that the budget really outlines some deteriorating fiscal indicators that I'm sure the finance minister is not happy about. But strictly speaking, I don't think you would describe the problems in this budget as a revenue problem, right? The revenues went up last year.
Yeah.
It's just the spending went up more and the deficit grew. Debt grew, the interest on debt grew. Those things tend to move together, but not always. The government, in the background briefing we received yesterday, they describe it as these things are being driven primarily by spending priorities and tax cuts. Those are political choices.
And they cost money. You blow a bigger hole in your deficit when you decide to, initially when you decide to cut taxes and forego revenues, and surprise, surprise, the deficit goes up.
Yeah. And, if this budget were presented by a liberal finance minister or a New Democrat finance minister, I think we can fairly guess what Peter Bethlenfalvy, where he's sitting in the opposition benches, would say about it. And he wouldn't be kind, right? He would be talking about a government that had lost control of spending, that was, pursuing all the wrong priorities. He would be going after the government hammer and tong if you were in the opposition benches.
You know the expression, JMM. Where you stand depends on where you sit,
yes.
Right?
Yes. And I should add, because I think some people in our audience might have raised an eyebrow at the assertion that the government has never cut healthcare spending, or I think the minister said, he was not going to cut health, education, or social services. And of course, the government, has cut some, very prominent social services like supervised consumption sites. We've spoken about that on the podcast. And certainly, if you speak to education unions, they would say that while the government may not have literally cut funding, that the spending on education has not grown in line with education or the growth of student enrollment
or inflation.
And in fact, the government's own numbers for the post-secondary sector, if you want to think of that as education broadly,
it's going down.
That expense is going down.
Yeah.
Literally, they are cutting spending in that ministry. So
now they would say, because the number of post-secondary students is going down as well.
It's true, yes.
With fewer foreign students coming in, they are going to spend, I think, $2 billion less next year versus this year.
Yes.
That's the explanation anyway.
Yes.
You know what else is weird? We're drinking less. Did you notice this? Look, there's thousands of numbers in the budget. We're not going to talk about all of them, but some of them do capture your attention.
Yes.
And when I saw that revenues for the LCBO are down, I don't know what, like $200 million or something year over year.
Yes.
People are drinking less. And I don't know. I think is that I don't know what, a post-COVID thing or what?
Yeah. So some of it is post-COVID. People may turn their minds back to some of the ways we self-medicated during the pandemic. But there is also some structural changes in how the government is getting revenue from alcohol sales, right? We've talked about moving beer and wine into corner stores and gas stations and all that. The government is making less revenue from those alcohol sales than it would have under the classic model. What's really interesting to me is that we're getting less money from the LCBO, even as the LCBO has taken over a preponderant share of the alcohol market. It used to be about 50% of all alcohol sold in Ontario. I believe this year they're projecting it to be 3/4 of all alcohol sales in Ontario will be coming either directly from LCBO stores or through these other independent vendors who, of course, have to buy wholesale from the LCBO. The government is also changing the tax structure. Long story short, the government had built up a kind of a rickety tax structure around alcohol where like all sorts of things were taxed at different rates and with, like, it was all very jury-rigged, if I could put it that way. They are now simplifying a lot of the tax structure, but I think the effect is going to be to lower revenues from alcohol in the future. And I'm pretty sure I remember reading in the budget that it will also make it easier to lower taxes in the future if they want to. And, the reasons you might want to, for example, would be to help some of these local Ontario wine, craft distiller, craft brewers, these kinds of things. Particularly, if we're drinking less anyway, lower alcohol taxes would not necessarily scare anybody about the potential public health impacts of people drinking more, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, we should just say here, let's do a little Economics 101. Yeah. The province of Ontario's fiscal year starts on the 1st of April.
Yes.
And it goes obviously till next March 31st. So essentially, this is the spending plan for the year to come.
Yes.
And spending plans are based on certain prognostications. They are based on certain assumptions that the finance minister believes the economy is going to perform at over the next year. And he bases his budget, I think he calls in all the bank, chief economists of the major banks and gets a sense about what they all think, what's inflation going to be, what are growth rates going to be, what do you think the prime rate's going to be, and then they make their budgets based on all of those projections.
Yes.
So that's the foundation upon which this thing is built. What are you thinking about what the projections are for the upcoming year?
So there is some optimism in this budget. They are not projecting a recession outright. They are anticipating a rebound in housing sales. We're talking about resale homes there. Resale homes make up the vast majority of home sales in any given year. New homes are a small fraction of the total homes that are sold in any year. But that's a bit of foreshadowing. There are gray clouds behind these silver linings. Housing starts, the new construction, were already projected to be bad in last year's budget. This year's budget revises all of those projections down even further. I want to be careful because we've talked about the HST tax credit, and so I don't think it's quite fair to say that the government's own numbers are projecting that the HST credit will fail. But I do think it's fair to say that if those are what the forecasts are, certainly the policies enacted to date are not working the way you would want to.
Now, let's continue with a couple of other assumptions. Number one, it's true that, they do start working on the budget, I wouldn't say immediately after they bring out the previous budget, but pretty much so. Certainly the Ministry of Finance starts working on the following year's budget in relatively short order after this one comes out. And there has not been a trade agreement between the United States and Canada, so that's the same. But to be sure, when this budget was printed, there was no war in the Middle East just yet.
Yeah.
And oil was at a certain value then, and it's at a different value right now.
Yeah.
And all of the assumptions in this budget are based on a pre-war number, not a post-war or a current war number.
Yes.
So how does all that work itself into the mix?
Right. So the budget assumes a price of oil bouncing around in the 60s. As we record this, we're looking at the price of oil for West Texas Intermediate, the American benchmark barrel of oil price. It was north of $95 a barrel last I checked. That was an hour ago. It's probably different already. The price of oil has two primary effects that we could talk about in Ontario based on how long a price spike lasts, right? There's that immediate impact where it's like that giant sucking sound of people's money out of their wallets into gas pumps, and any money that is spent on gasoline to fill people's tanks is not going to be spent on, tourism or restaurants or like all of that discretionary spending is just going to go into gasoline instead. And so that's going to have an impact on the economy, a negative impact on the economy. The other one, if this goes longer, and I don't think anybody wants to make any detailed predictions about how long the chaos in the Middle East could go. If this goes longer and we see a very prolonged period of high oil prices, this is what we saw earlier in the last decade, in the early 2010s, where oil prices went up and they stayed up, and Ontario shed loads of manufacturing jobs. And, overall, there's actually some debate among economists. Overall, for most Canadians, it might have been a net plus because the value of the dollar went up and global goods got cheaper for us. But obviously, particularly for this government, which has staked so much of its political capital on preserving and growing manufacturing jobs, and is focused right now on preserving and growing the export sector. If we see a lengthy period of a high Canadian dollar hurting Canadian exports, that would be just objectively bad for the Ontario economy. And then it would also clearly, I think it would clearly be politically harmful to this government.
Can I do a one hand on the other hand thing, though?
Sure. Yeah.
And somebody, I can't remember which reporter, but in the lockup yesterday at the where was it held? Whitney.
Yes, in Whitney Block, in the Cabinet Office Communications Center.
Right.
The bunker, we call it.
In the bunker in the basement. Some reporter did ask the Minister of Finance, are you even a little bit secretly pleased that oil is at $90 a barrel now? Because, of course, the Ontario government, while it did reduce the tax on gasoline a few years ago and made that permanent, it still does. There's a windfall to come.
It collects HST, right?
There you go.
That's a fraction of the liter price. So there will be more revenue coming in.
So the question was, are you secretly happy about that? And his answer was, I haven't even thought about that at all. Now, I suppose that's plausible, but there probably are people in the building who are wondering what the windfall to the Treasurer of Ontario will be with West Texas Intermediate at 95 a barrel instead of 60 a barrel. You got to believe that, right?
Yeah, and I think it's worth distinguishing between, obviously a province like Alberta, they get a really direct windfall from higher oil prices because they collect resource royalties. And what we're talking about here is the sales tax on the sale of gasoline at the pump. There will be some increase in revenue there, but I think these models get complicated because does it offset, like if there are job losses and the Treasury loses income tax revenue, if the Treasury has to pay out income supports through like Ontario Works, I modeling that kind of activity is way beyond my competence. I'm the journalism school of math.
I was told there'd be no math here today, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Anything else, or are we moving on?
No, I would just say, not to be Debbie Downer too much, but those two big questions, right? The renegotiation of CUSMA and the fate of oil prices really do call in a lot of the assumptions underlying this budget into question. Obviously, we are going to see what events unfold.
Events, dear boy, events, as the finance minister did say. Well, you and I were both in the lockup yesterday, and we both wrote columns based on different things that we saw in the budget, and we're going to talk about those coming up next. Time now for our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I have a little chat here about the columns we wrote for TVO.org. Usually I say over the past week, but in fact we wrote them yesterday.
Yes.
So why don't you start us off?
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this HST credit. We've already discussed the substance of the announcement. The government projects that it will induce 8,000 new homes to be built. That's not 8,000 new homes this year. That's 8,000 new homes between now and 2031. So anybody hoping that this was going to rescue Ontario's housing sector, I would say curb your enthusiasm. And, I think the broader point I want to make about this is that, how governments address a problem really depends on whether they are diagnosing the correct problem or diagnosing the problem correctly, if I can put it that way. At the beginning of the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes said that the fundamentals of the Western economies were genuinely strong, but that the key problem was that there was gunk in the financial sector that needed to be fixed. Gunk, the technical economic term, and that if you could just address that small discrete problem, there was no reason to believe that economies couldn't roar back to life. And of course, policymakers did not pay attention to whom. The Depression got worse. It's not actually a happy story. We kind of have the opposite problem in Ontario right now, where I think the government keeps acting like we just have this small problem to fix and the housing sector will come roaring back to life. And I think the problems are more fundamental and require more aggressive solutions. And even just to take this HST tax credit as an example, I very strongly suspect that next year we are going to learn that the tax credit is being extended for another year. And I would not be surprised at all to see it extended another year beyond that. But I don't think that's going to be as powerful, as effective, as if the government were to simply have said this year, this tax credit will be in place for 3 years, right? I think what we want to see is we want to see developers start planning for the future. That we want them to hire back the workers they have shed. We want them to start making plans to start new developments that they have shelved. We really need to be thinking about fundamentally trying to restart a stalled economy, and I don't think this measure will do it. Obviously, fairness to the government, this is not the only thing they are doing on the housing file. We expect to see new legislation from the housing minister in the spring sitting, and federally, the same day as the Ontario budget, the federal government announced that a new $1.7 billion that they intend to spend before the end of the fiscal year, which means in coming weeks. So there are other things happening, and I don't want to make it sound like this is, this was the crux of their entire housing plan, and it's a disaster already. But I do worry that they are not diagnosing the problems correctly and addressing them seriously enough.
I'll tell you what, I don't talk about this a lot because I like to cover the housing sector as well. And when I mention the fact that my brother's a home builder in the Southern Ontario area, it reminds me that I have an appearance of a conflict of interest whenever I talk about housing. So he and I don't talk about it very much. But I did read in my local newspaper, the Hamilton Spectator, the other day, a quote from a Jeff Paikin from New Horizon Development Group saying his business is off 98% this year. 98%. And you know what that means? That means taxes on homes are not being paid. That means workers are being laid off because there are no homes being built. The stuff in the pipeline has come to a complete stop. And I don't know if his situation is better or worse than anybody else's, but I got a feeling that most builders in the province of Ontario are suffering a similar fate right now. And yeah, you're right. There's no silver bullet to bring it back. No. It's going to take, as they say in government, a suite of initiatives.
Yes.
To turn the corner here.
Well, and just to add one thing very quickly, this is sort of happening at the worst possible time because a lot of the workforce in the building trades was getting older. This was a known problem. That's why the government has focused so much on training up lots of young people in the trades. But one of the things that a variety of builder groups were warning about now almost 2 years ago was if we go into a prolonged slump, a whole bunch of people who were thinking about retiring in 5 to 10 years time, they're going to do what they can to just retire now, and then we're never going to get those workers back. They are going to be financially secure, or maybe they only come back part-time or whatever, and it's going to be extremely difficult to grow that workforce back to the level we need if you want to get to the place where we're building 150,000 homes a year, which the government has largely abandoned the idea of the 1.5 million new homes by 2031. It's not going to happen, but that would be the level of building you would need to see to get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we hinted in our interview with the Minister of Finance, I did my column on a subject that has just simply confounded me for the last many, many years, and that is the notion that we are spending as taxpayers $7 billion a year, just about, to subsidize people's electricity bills. I think I mentioned this to the Finance Minister. The government of Ontario sends me essentially sends me a check for $46 every month to help me pay my hydro bill. And I don't know why. I don't need it. I don't want it. Send it to somebody who does need it and does want it. Do I want to live in a province where people who have difficulty paying their electricity bills because they're low income need some extra help and need a relief program to help do that? Yeah, I sure do. But do I want the finance minister who makes six figures a year, Doug Ford who makes six figures a year? Do I want all people who are higher income and may very well live in bigger homes and as a result use even more electricity? Do I want them to have their electricity bills subsidized by the taxpayers? I don't see how that makes sense. And every independent analyst on this subject that I have talked to, who does not have a membership in the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, says I'm right, yes, that this makes no sense whatsoever. And so I'm going to continue to ask the finance minister every year on budget day, why are you continuing to do things this way when it makes so much more sense to specifically direct the money to people who need it and not give it to people who don't? And, if he keeps giving me the same lame answer, I'm going to keep asking him the same lame question. Sorry. That's what my column's about.
Can we give people a little bit of the behind the scenes in the
Sure,
lockup?
Go for it.
The way it goes is, we get questions from the back of the room to the front, and I was seated near the back of the room, so I got my question in early. And as the questions move forward, and I don't hear Steve's voice, and you came in at a different time. We were seated in different parts of the room.
I was sitting right at the front.
And as we get, you can sort of feel that the briefing is going to wrap up, and I'm like, Steve hasn't asked anything. We haven't gotten a question from Steve. What's going on? And then right at the end, right under the wire, you got your question in.
I was the last guy to get a question in.
And you heard me laughing from the back of the room because I was like, another year down. We know it's okay. Steve got his question in. We were worried we'd have to do a wellness check if we didn't hear your question.
But you know what? I sort of, worked the room a little bit afterwards, and I talked to Rob Benzic from the Toronto Star, and he says, you saw, I put your question and the answer to your question in my piece. Yes, I did. There are lots of people who are reporting on this fact. Anyway, you know the story. So, it persists. And so will I. And with that, let's get off to the mailbag here,
Absolutely.
Shall we? Okay, if you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what's up this week?
We have a question from Mike Tremblay from somewhere in Northern Ontario. He did not specify. I should say this is related to the issue of the expansion of the Billy Bishop Airport. For all of us in Northern Ontario, the Island Airport is a vital, convenient link to the south from Timmins, Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, and North Bay, and all the remote communities they serve. We Northerners will be the big losers on this file. Already, Porter is cancelling service to Toronto from North Bay and Sudbury and rerouting to Ottawa. Likely all decisions have been made, and we're just in the implementation phase. Very disappointed. Yours, Mike Tremblay.
Can you help Mike with his disappointment at all on this?
Well, I do want to just say before I start, I do think it's important to note just how important Porter is in northern communities. I've literally heard people from, for example, Sault Ste. Marie say that when Porter started flying to Sault Ste. Marie, it was their version of the Berlin Wall coming down. They suddenly felt like the Toronto was just so much more accessible for them. And so I don't want to dismiss that at all. So of course, the expansion of Billy Bishop Airport is a priority for the Premier. It is mentioned, of course, in the budget. This is where they commit to basically taking over the currently city-owned portion of the airport lands, and they are going to be the legislation that is introduced as part of the budget process. They are going to take over the city's position basically in the operation of the airport. The province saying that this expansion will support a more competitive and resilient economy, reduce crowding at Pearson. I'm very skeptical on that front, but whatever, and will offer more flight options at competitive prices to other destinations, will create thousands of jobs, support construction, tourism, and transportation sectors. But this is the concern that people like Mike are raising, that if this airport can now support jets that will fly to more distant and potentially more lucrative routes to and not just serving Northern Ontario, that these communities like Sudbury, like Timmins, like Sault Ste. Marie could lose out, even if, just assuming the government's arguments for the sake of argument, even if it's a net benefit to the province, there could be losers in northern communities.
It's a very reasonable concern. I know if a government representative were here, they would be saying something like, but don't forget about the Northlander. We're restoring that train from Union Station going up north. It's not going to get to Sudbury, mind you. It will get to North Bay and points north of North Bay. So that might mitigate that concern somewhat, but certainly not entirely.
No, and the Northlanders actually plays a few interesting bits in the budget. First of all, the government is saying that the construction of the new tracks and everything will be done this year in 2026. So that's actually a reasonable success for this government. We'll see whether the train is actually in operation this year. I think it might actually have to start running next year, but construction, they're saying, will be complete this year. And then there's another item that I want to mention, because they are going to start using Northern Ontario communities as kind of a guinea pig, maybe we want to say laboratory of democracy. At the moment, Ontario municipalities have the power to regulate ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft. And what the government is proposing to do is standardize those regulations at a provincial level, functionally upload the regulation of ride-sharing services. Bunch of questions about what that might look like, whether this ends up being a gift to companies like Uber, but shelve that for the moment, because what they want to do is help make it easier, particularly in the north, for people to access the communities where the Northlander will stop. So the idea is that the restored Northlander, which was, of course, decommissioned by the previous Liberal government, this restored Northlander gives them the opportunity to test on a smaller scale what harmonized rideshare regulations would look like. They're going to do that in Northern Ontario first, and then I guess they will see what works and what does not. And but the intention, at least implied in the budget, is that those harmonized regulations would then be made province-wide.
Mike, thanks for that letter, and we appreciate having the chance to talk about Northern Ontario on this program as well, where we have so many loyal and wonderful viewers. Give the email address if you would, sir, and let's get out of here.
Yes, absolutely. Again, if you'd like to ask any questions about content on the show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, March 27th, 2026, the day after the Ontario budget, but more importantly, opening day for your Toronto Blue Jays, the defending American League champions. Go Jays.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Please write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
For maybe one more day.
Yes.
Right? We just had a retirement party for John this very week.
Yes, I think this is the last episode for
This
him.
probably will be the last episode in which we say his name. So, John, thanks for your contribution to TVO and all the support you gave this program over the years.
And congratulations on your retirement.
Amen to that, yeah. Special thanks as well as always to our crew. Tina over here. Who's back over there? Who's on one? Hello, Dave. Dave and I are commiserating over the Leafs these days. The team can't win when we want them to win. They can't lose when we want them to lose. It just is completely nonsensical. Anyway, we appreciate your work here in the studio to make this podcast happen in video form. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.